Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back to MeZooMin. We don't get to meet as often with BTU starting and all the other speakers that we're bringing in, but it's good to be back for a regular MeZooMin session here, and also with a very special guest this evening, who we'll tell you about in a little while. But first, let's hear from our rabbis, Rabbi Yogev, Rabbi Wahlberg. Are you out there, and how are you doing?
I'm out here, and Baruch Hashem, I don't get to see too many people. The only people from Beth Tefillah that I really get to see is people I bump into at physical therapy. We could meet half of our shul at physical therapy. It's really remarkable. I'm really fortunate to be rabbi of such a congregation.
I think you see half of them at physical therapy, and Rabbi Yogev and I see the other half of them at shul.
At shul, yeah, the ones that I got to pick. I've been reading 2 books. By the way, now on my Facebook page, I'm listing all the books that I'm reading and the articles that I'm reading in case people are interested. But the 2 books I've been reading now one is really excellent. A Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision-Making by a Jason Weiner. We should have him here once. This guy knows his stuff. No, in the back of the book, he has a haskama from Professor Avram Steinberg and Rav Asher Weiss, who are considered the 2 giants in the field. And they're writing about his book. It really unbelievable. The other book I've been reading is when I go to sleep at night, Sherry reads this to me these days, Good Night, Trump. It's really a fascinating story, and I'm finding that I sleep very, very well from reading it. So I might want to recommend both of these books to you.
If you're sleeping well, then we're all sleeping well.
Rabbi Yogev, could you think of anything more spiritual than just what I just said?
I'm left speechless, actually. Rabbi Weiner, you see, this is the fun we have in our shul.
Absolutely.
And I often recommend my book for people who have sleeping problems. So
wait, I'll tell you someday about my book, Rabbi. Don't worry.
Okay.
Rabbi Yogev, how you doing?
I'm well. I'm feeling good. Just grateful that amidst everything that's going on all around us, our shul's still going. And it's enjoyable, and we're trying to find Hashem even amidst all of this. So Baruch Hashem, we have a minyan every day. Sometimes it's hard, but Baruch Hashem, it's just a big blessing. Before
we bring on our special guest, do you want to share our trivia question for this week?
Yeah, sure. So this week's parsha is Chayei Sarah, and the question connected to Chayei Sarah, trivia question is, how many times does Eliezer's name, it's Avram's servant, how many times does his first name appear in the parsha? So you have a few options. You have A, 0, B, 1, C, 7, and D, 12. Please offer your answers in the chat section here on Facebook Live. We're checking that too, and we'll see who gets it right.
So people are going to have to be checking their Chumash as we're having this going on, because I know Avram's servant plays a major role. Yeah. Maybe he comes up a lot of times. I don't know. We'll have to see and wait for our answer. All right, that's our question. Those are our possible answers. And now I want to turn to welcoming our special guest here for this evening. Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner. Rabbi Weiner is a colleague of ours. He's someone who I call to ask difficult halachic and ethical medical ethics questions. In fact, I'll tell you a little secret that one of my Rabbi Love, who I call often, sometimes I call him up and he'll say, you really should call Rabbi Weiner for this. And Rabbi Love was one of Rabbi Weiner's Rabbeim also. So
I heard that from Rabbi Linzer also before.
Yeah, so it tells
our head of our yeshiva.
It tells you what they feel about him. The truth is, it's hard to find someone who has the halachic knowledge and insight and warmth and integrity to be someone who can rule on very, very difficult issues, but also has the down to, you know, down to earth, practical understanding of what's going on in hospitals. And so for a long time, we've been wanting to bring Rabbi Weiner in for a speaker. In fact, we had planned to bring him in as a speaker, I think around this time. I think we had talked about October, November. And we're not getting him in person. I hope one day we will get him in here on person, because he has a lot to teach and a lot to share on. But we thought it could be very, very insightful for us and interesting to hear from him about what it's been like being a rabbi on the front lines. He's not a medical professional. He's a rabbi who's a chaplain. And I'm sure he knows a lot of medical from dealing with it. But what is a rabbi, during these days, during the past months, what it's like for them. So welcome in Rabbi Jason Weiner to our MeZooMin episode.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind introduction. It's really great to be with you all. Thank you.
Awesome. So we discussed that this is a two-part series. We have Rabbi Weiner here this Thursday night and next Thursday night. We discussed in advance that this Thursday night we would come with some questions. Some of our rabbis here would ask you some questions and sort of see where the conversation goes. And we invite everyone to react in the chat if you'd like, and to ask any questions that you'd like to ask. And then we'll take it from there in terms of what our topic is for discussion for next week. So Rabbi Wahlberg, let me start with you and see if you want to ask your question or your set of questions to Rabbi Weiner. Rabbi Wahlberg, you are muted.
Very rarely.
You are muted.
Very rarely.
Oh.
It doesn't relate to the coronavirus. I don't think our congregants realize how often we're called upon with questions that's Rabbi Weiner's so-called expertise. So I want to ask a question like this. A family has a member of the family who's suffering from Alzheimer's, dementia, who's not aware of their basic surroundings. And that person develops cancer. Should that person be treated for the cancer? I myself personally am very conflicted by that question. And I'd be interested to hear what Rabbi Weiner has to say about it.
It's a great question. I mean, dementia and Alzheimer's is one of the most common and most painful issues that we struggle with, and trying to make decisions on behalf of people that's both what they would want if they could speak clearly, and also what we think is in their best interest. And so it's really hard to give, general answers, like a one-size-fits-all answer, because everything depends on who that person is, who they are, what their values are, what's important to them. So
does Halacha make a demand on us irrespective of the person?
Yeah, there's a mixture in Halacha between the definite demands that it makes and then the wiggle room that there is sometimes for the person's own perspective. Like on Yom Kippur, we often say, like a person who's sick, sometimes based on their desire to eat, is part of the factor in terms of if they should eat or not. We say that, for example, regarding a pregnant woman or things like that, where their desire does have an impact, and their pain and suffering has a huge impact. So it depends, if they're generally happy, they're generally suffering. So my role as a chaplain in particular in dealing with a question like this would be to get to know the person, to get to know the family, how much I felt that they can handle, how much they can handle, how much emotional, existential suffering is involved, and help them kind of figure out what works best for their family. Oftentimes, we definitely recognize that no matter what cognitive state a person is in, every human being is created in the image of God. Everyone deserves, that basic general respect and dignity, and to be treated equally in that way. But we have to figure out, when we're prolonging life and when we're prolonging suffering. And we definitely want to prolong life. We do everything we can to prolong life. but we don't necessarily prolong suffering. In fact,
But a
sometimes it might
person
be the
with
wrong
having
thing.
Alzheimer's may not, can we refer to that person as being suffering?
It depends on that person. There's a similar question that comes up with Alzheimer's that comes up a lot is, let's say, God forbid, someone has Alzheimer's and their partner, their spouse, their a relative dies, and they're told, and they suffer horribly and they cry, and then the next day they say, where is this person? Where are they? They forgot. Should we tell them again? And then again, they forget the next day. Should we tell them again? And usually I'm on the side personally where I would say not to tell them again. I don't think you're required to be overly honest sometimes when it's just causing pain and suffering over and over and over again.
But you would tell them originally.
Most likely, but not necessarily. It really depends on the case.
All right, let me ask you one other question. Given an opportunity as a chaplain, Rabbi Yoga chose to be a chaplain in a prison. You chose to be a chaplain in a hospital. We don't know what motivated him. In general, we don't know what motivates him. What motivated you?
That's a great question. So I can't say that I chose to be a chaplain in a hospital. I like how you worded it, but back when when I was in yeshiva, we went to the same yeshiva. We were required at that time. I don't know if you guys were. We were required to do a little bit of a rotation in a hospital. I was at Beth Israel on the Lower East Side, and at the end of my rotation, we had to write like a little summary kind of exit interview. What did you learn from this? How will this impact your rabbinate? And I remember I wrote on there, at least I learned now that I don't want to be a chaplain. And then, I graduated. I went to become a rabbi. I was assistant rabbi at Young Israel Century City with Rabbi Muskin here in Los Angeles. And I was happy doing that. That was my plan, to be in the pulpit like all of you. And Rabbi Levi Meir of blessed memory, who was the rabbi here at Cedar Sinai for 30 years at that time, was a member of our shul, and he got sick. And he told Rabbi Muskin, and Rabbi Muskin felt, you need someone to help you out. So he kind of voluntold me that I would be helping him out, 10 hours a week. Then it was 20 hours a week. And at first I didn't want to go, but the truth is I fell in love with it. And so to answer your question, what happened to me there, and I loved it in the pulpit. I loved teaching Torah, working with people, developing relationships, helping to build the shul, make it inspiring, trying to attract people. When I got into the hospital though, I really, I felt, first of all, I love the diversity. And some shuls have that diversity, some shuls don't. But I loved all walks of life. There's no barriers to coming into a hospital. Some people feel comfortable in some shuls, other shuls in the hospital. Everyone comes to a hospital. And there's this kind of universal human experience that people are going through. And I felt like I was really put on the front lines of life and death and meaning, and trying to be there for people and make Judaism relevant, show how Judaism is relevant in these difficult times. And so I just found it very inspiring, very meaningful, and I just fell in love with it.
See, that's where the rabbinate changed from all of you, from your time to my time. You were required as part of your training to spend time with people in a prison or in a hospital. I was required as part of my training to spend time with chickens and cows. Completely different approach, completely different. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Rabbi Weiner, you mentioned, being on the front lines of life and death. Let's rewind, and you probably know better than I if we're talking about this becoming relevant again. But there was definitely a time where I think maybe the number one medical ethical question that was going around was like running out of ventilators and decisions around that. Could you speak a little bit about that and a little bit about your thinking and maybe how it affected the hospital there?
Yeah, that was a scary time because first of all, we were watching what was happening in other countries. I remember at that time in particular, Italy and elsewhere, and also here in LA, we were watching what was happening in New York, and we were trying to prepare for the worst and be ready for if there wouldn't be enough ventilators, if there wouldn't be enough ICU rooms. Our hospital created a whole nother ICU floor. We turned one of our standard floors into an ICU unit. And it was scary because we were realizing that we might have to make decisions of literally who will live and who will die. And it's not a decision you want to make. In medicine, you want to save lives, not have to choose between lives. So we were trying to come up with, policies for that. And the hospital I work at here at Cedar Sinai in Los Angeles is a Jewish hospital, but it's different than, like, let's say a Catholic hospital where it's guided specifically by the mandates of the Catholic Church. Judaism is part of our, our identity, but it's not the only aspect of how decisions are made. So I was trying to figure out, what does the halacha say, so I could inform the bioethics committee's decisions on how we would do it. And we created a policy, and we were just like, watching the numbers. And as they were increasing, we were just scared because we didn't want to have to implement that policy. And thankfully we didn't have to. But it was like the scary moment of like having to realize that we had to make some decisions, and we had to be prepared to make decisions that no one ever wants to make, but sometimes you just have to be ready to make. So we had to step up and be ready to make them.
Wow. Rabbi Yogev.
That brings me to like a question I wanted to ask. Curious, like, so you mentioned the tough decision. I'm curious, like, about perhaps like a complicated decision that you were engaged in over these months, and maybe you could share with us a little bit of the process of how you arrived at the conclusion that you arrived at. It's kind of like who you talked with, like how does that work? Like what's the deliberation?
Yeah, there were a lot. I mean, just to run the
I remember like
triage.
when we were in yeshiva, you came and you shared some of these like really fascinating stories, and like I went to this, I went to Rabbi West and all these other. So.
Yeah, and it's hard because you were very kind, Rabbi Posner, in your introduction. But I have there's many greater, much greater thinkers and religious decisors than me, and so obviously I have to turn to them, especially when we get into these life and death decisions. So I'll just give you one example.
I would add something that.
What's interesting is that sometimes they have to turn to you too. What I mean by that is there's the law, right, and there's the application of the law, and oftentimes you'll a rabbi who doesn't know what's going on the ground could have a great idea, but that's not how it gets implemented.
Good point.
Yeah, I would also just add that like why it interests me is I know you're saying you're perhaps not the posek that we people might talk about, but you're connected and plugged into many different post games. So it's always interesting hearing your perspective and like who you've talked to and how you arrived at your conclusion.
Thank you. So I'll share one example that you made me think of since we were talking about triage. One debate we were having at our hospital, I know a lot of hospitals were debating this, was, let's say you come up with your policy and how you're going to choose who to treat, which was basically a public health approach to try to save the most lives possible, and how to properly triage in order to save as many lives as possible. So what if you determine that based on your triage policies, 2 patients who come in are completely equal in all of the policies that we have set out? What are the tiebreakers? How do you choose between 2 who are otherwise equal in their situation?
What would be some issue what would be, I'm sorry, just to clarify for people, what would be like some of the considerations that go?
Yeah, so let's say you were deciding that you were going to use the ventilators for people who would likely need it for the shortest amount of time, and the people who are most likely to survive. And that was the decision. So in order to be able to use as many ventilators as possible and save as many lives, you're prioritizing people who would need the ventilator for the shortest amount of time and have the highest likelihood of surviving. And there were a number of medical factors that helped us decide and actually rank patients, and that way choose who would get the ventilator. We never came to that, thankfully. We got close, actually, but we never came to it.
And that was based on what the doctor suggested, or based on
totally based on medical determinations. Yes. But then once you have this ranking and you rank each patient based on medical determinations, who's going to get the ventilator, sometimes they rank the same. They could be 2 people that have the same ranking in terms of how long they'll need the ventilator and their likelihood of surviving once they're weaned off the ventilator. So once they're the same medically, then you have to have tiebreakers. And that becomes the real moral challenges. How do you break the tie? Who should go first? And one big debate that we began debating was, well, should medical professionals be ranked higher? Because number one, if you work in the ICU, let's say you work in the ICU, in a COVID ICU, and you think to yourself, why am I risking my life? Should I really risk my life for my patients? I have a family, I have children. Is this really worth it, risking my life for my job? And if your hospital would tell you, well, if you get sick, God forbid, we will prioritize you. We will take care of you. We will save your life. That might encourage people to, be willing to take that risk. Also, and we're having this actually right now in some states. I just was reading today about, I'm pretty sure South Dakota, but I could be wrong, that some states were saying that medical professionals have to return to work even when they still show symptoms. But once they're over the most severe phases, because they're having shortages of medical professionals, they need them back. So if you get sick, we don't have enough. And so part of the idea was, if we prioritize healthcare professionals, we can get them better quicker, get them back on the front lines. That was the debate. So our hospital was debating this, and we knew, we're going to have a meeting, and everyone needs to give their feedback. And I'm thinking to myself, well, my job is, I'm the rabbi of the hospital, so my job is to figure out what's the halacha, and I'm going to provide. I'm not necessarily going to win this debate, but I would at least need to provide that perspective. So I reached out to two people. And I got the opposite answers, actually, which is another challenge. But actually, Rabbi Wahlberg mentioned the two people that wrote Haskamas, approbations on my book. That's who I reached out to. First, I reached out to Dr. Avram Steinberg, because I knew he was preparing for the state of Israel, not just for Shaare Zedek Medical Center, where he's the ethicist, but the state of Israel, literally, which is fascinating. They created a committee, their triage committee, which was made up of people who are religious, secular, Jewish, and not Jewish, for all the hospitals in the country. And the head of the committee is an Orthodox rabbi and doctor, neurologist, Dr. Steinberg. So I asked him first, what are you doing in Israel about this issue? It hadn't been published yet. They were still working on it. And what's your approach? Have you dealt with this issue of, should healthcare professionals get priority? And he said, we decided yes, healthcare professionals will. Otherwise, every human being is equal. It doesn't matter religion, nationality, Palestinian, Israeli, Syrian refugee, everyone's equal. Everyone gets treated equally in a hospital. The one exception is, all else being equal, healthcare professionals go first. He said it's based on, there is a ruling in the Talmud that if you have that, to choose between two Kohanim, actually, the Kohen who is the assistant for the Kohen Gadol, God Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Meshuach Melchama, the Kohen whose job was to inspire the people in a time of war, that the Talmud says you save the Kohen Meshuach Melchama, because Rashi explains on the Talmud there, Rabim Tzrichim Lo, he is needed by the masses, by the community, and therefore people who are needed by the masses should gain priority. So he said that's what we're doing in the state of Israel. I'd also reached out to Rav Asher Weiss, the other person who wrote Haskama, approbation of my book, because he's the posek for Shaare Zedek. He is considered in the medical world, one of the leading rabbinic authorities dealing with these questions. And he's the one who, when Shaare Zedek Medical Center in Jerusalem has their most difficult questions, they turn to him, and he's their decider, and he publishes them. And he's a really nuanced, interesting thinker. And I asked him, "What's your position on this?" And he said, I don't believe any human being should ever be given precedence. You can't make choices based on their profession. He says it's too hard. Yes, I know the Talmud says the person who's needed by the masses should gain precedence, but how can we really decide who's needed by the masses? How can you say that other patient laying there in the stretcher waiting for a respirator, how do you know if they're not more needed? Maybe they're a teacher, maybe they have a big family, maybe they're writing. We never know. You never know in what way people are needed by the masses. And he felt, I don't think it's ever fair to give anyone priority. You have to find only medical criteria. We can't start choosing who goes first, because you're going to end up making decisions that could be inappropriate. So I felt stuck. I felt like, oh gosh, now I've heard both opinions. So you know what? That's what I'll share with the committee. I'll just say, they're within the Jewish tradition, we have both perspectives. Here's what the state of Israel is doing. Here's what this great rabbi is doing. And I'm going to need more people to help me decide. I can't. And so our committee ended up deciding, not based only on that, based on just what they felt was ethically most appropriate. They decided, some hospitals decided to give healthcare professionals priority. We decided not to. We decided that everyone should be equal, and only decisions should be made based on medical criteria. But there's an example, Rabbi Yogev, of a question where I just felt like, oh, this is a tough one.
Someone just two questions from the chat. Someone just put in the chat, just based on what you were just talking about. What about an important person, a well-known prominent rabbi? I assume they mean according to the position that no one was going to be given preference.
Yeah, I mean, you could make that argument based on that Talmudic source that a great rabbi should get precedence. But this is the concern. This was the concern that Rav Asher Weiss was sharing with me, that you're gonna start. What are you gonna start doing? Ranking the rabbis and like determining, well, if they're in the top 10, then you save them. But if they're in the, I mean, it's
Well, what if it was just ranking the rabbis of Beth Tefillah?
then
I
you
have
could,
bad
right?
news for you. Wecker gets saved. There's no question.
Rabbi Weiner, that's our Shamus and Balkore. So he wins down always in terms of that. So just to go back a little bit, because this was another question that came in, I guess doubling down on this, and it's come up for us. I know, Rabbi Wilberg and I have talked about it for sure in the past. Someone asked, what would be you mentioned that sometimes maybe you would not even tell, let's say, a spouse who has Alzheimer's or dementia or whatever, you wouldn't tell them that someone passed away. You said usually you would tell them, maybe not. What would be a situation where you wouldn't even tell them in the first place?
If we could, it's actually based on this week's parsha. I'll tell you why. If we could determine that a person would experience severe mental anguish that they might not be able to handle, especially because, let's say, they're emotionally or physically very frail, and we could determine, usually ideally based on real mental health expert input, that they would be severely negatively impacted by receiving very bad news, then this week's parsha, Chaye Sarah. So it starts with Sarah's death, and Rashi once again says, why do we hear about Sarah's death right after last week's parsha? We heard about the near sacrifice of her son Isaac. So he says, because when she heard the bad news that he almost died, not even that he did, but that she almost lost her son, she couldn't handle it, she died. And there is a traditional belief in Judaism that we call it tiruf hadat in halacha, which means acute mental anguish, tearing of the mind. If something is so difficult to handle, there are times when it can be justified not sharing it with somebody in order to protect their emotional well-being, which can also obviously impact their physical well-being.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit, because it took us in that direction, about issues that may come up with mental illness or with mental anguish. A little bit about sort of what some of the thinking is. Does halacha recognize that there can be pain, mental anguish, mental sickness? How does that weigh into factors in thinking?
Yeah, so this category is really important of tiruf hadat. We in Judaism, in halacha, as you know, I think most people know very well. It's something that we're very proud of in our tradition. That we take physical health very seriously. Pekuach nefesh, saving a life, overrides almost everything in the Torah. People drive to the hospital on Shabbat. Whatever they have to do to save a life is permissible in order to prolong life. But in addition to that, we say whatever is needed for emotional health, for mental health, is considered physical health. So we also do what we can in order to protect someone's emotional well-being. And it's not only because we're afraid, maybe if someone's emotional well-being is very poor, then they will do very bad physically. No, it's in order to protect. There is a value simply in having strong mental health. Just like the example that I mentioned with Sarah in this week's parsha, we're going to read in a few weeks about when Yaakov meets Yosef, his son Joseph, again after so many years, and it says v'yapag libo, he like has a heart attack from the good news. There's a constant theme. There's a story from Chizkiyahu, the king, whose prophet Isaiah. He hears bad news from Isaiah, and he says to Isaiah, "Don't you know you're not supposed to give someone bad news if they can't handle it? I can't handle the news you're telling me." The Torah way is to be very careful about how you treat someone's mental well-being. That's considered part of their physical well-being as well. That's why we say in the Misha Berach, when we pray for someone's health, we say refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf. May they have a recovery of the body and recovery of the soul. And actually, we say refuat hanefesh first. That's part of well-being, is emotional well-being. That's why oftentimes, I heard this from Rabbi Meir of blessed memory, who I mentioned before. He would often say that even when someone is so sick that they cannot, that it's impossible for them to be cured, when there's no cure, even when a cure is impossible, sometimes healing is still possible, because healing can be emotional, existential, and that's still possible even when the body can't heal.
So what about
they're intertwined.
What about the sort of the opposite of that last case you just said, and someone put it into the chat, a situation where there's a small chance and I know we're asking you complicated questions that all have a lot of details to them, but a small chance of someone surviving but very painful treatment.
Right.
How are the ways that we look at that?
Yeah, I mean, Judaism, halacha also takes suffering very seriously. So we don't want to prolong suffering. We believe that pain control, pain management, palliative care is a mitzvah. So even though we do want to do whatever we can to prolong life, we don't want to prolong suffering. So if a person can be treated such that they will overcome their suffering and their suffering won't exist anymore and they can live, so then it's a mitzvah. But if it will just be prolonging suffering, that is not required. And sometimes, we can understand why someone would want to allow suffering to end. We would never intentionally hasten someone's death, but we can understand why someone would want to allow their life to end, even if it would, in other words, not actively prolong life in the face of very severe suffering. We have an example of this also in the Bible. That's Saul, King Saul. That some use his example that he was about to be attacked, and so he died rather than endure the incredible suffering that would have been brought upon him.
So when I was in yeshiva, we did do, I think for Rabbi Yogev, by then actually they were doing even more extensive chaplaincy training. When I was in yeshiva, I think we did like a week or so where we went and spent some time in hospitals. And I have to look up the exit interview. It's possible that I said the same thing as you did. I know that I felt it at the time. Though being a shul rabbi, you get to spend more time certainly in hospitals. But I remember at the time, like being afraid of the question, and I wonder if I still am. I don't know, but I'm sure you deal with it often, and that's the question that I want to put to you. What you say to someone to give them hope, to give them inspiration when the question is something like, and I'm sure you're dealing with it a lot, when it feels like there isn't hope, there isn't good, and people kind of ask that question, why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering? Why is God doing this to me? So just in about a minute, answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's a very common question, and it's a very difficult question. I actually remember, I've gone through different phases of how I answer that question because it's so common. I remember literally one time.
Are we asking Rabbi wanted to explain why bad things happen to good people?
Hey, we gave you that chance, Rabbi. You never answered it. Quiet down. Let him answer the question.
Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know the answer. I do, but I didn't want to make him look bad. There's a whole book of Job written about this question, and we expect Rabbi Weiner from California to provide the answer.
Well, not if you don't let him talk.
He's lowered the stakes for you now. So
Okay, go ahead.
Nothing against California. Not that someone being from California therefore wouldn't have the answer, right? Of course.
No.
I mean, and I'm not I don't have the answer, but what I'll share is two things. One is that obviously I totally agree with Rabbi Wolberg. I don't think that there is an answer, and so I go through different ways of how I answer this question. And I believe that kind of the answer of I don't know actually is a profound answer, but I'll share with you why I don't say that anymore. But I remember literally once being called into a patient's room at 2 a.m. I'm sure you've had this as rabbis. You get these calls, and I come to the hospital. They said it has to be right now. We need the rabbi. It's urgent. And what had happened was, I remember walking to the ICU, and I was being informed by the daughter of the patient that he had just gotten very bad news and is probably not going to survive much longer. And she's just so upset, and she wants to know, why is this happening to us? Why do bad things happen to good people? I need the answer because I'm so distraught. And she says to me, so Rabbi, so we called you. I know it's late at night, but we need the answer. It's just, we're so troubled. So I said to her, oh, gosh, I don't know. So I remember her turning to the nurse and saying, can you call a different rabbi?
Bring the priest.
What?
Bring the priest.
Yeah, I know. It was like, okay, I failed you. Let's call another rabbi. I was like, I think you're stuck with me. It's pretty late right now. But so the way I answer that question is because I don't think that there's an answer I don't think there's an answer that human minds can fathom. I think, things that are godly, divine, of that complicated nature are not we're simply not able to fathom them. It can't fit into finite brains. So usually, really what I do when people ask me questions like that, the job of a chaplain, of rabbis as well. I mean, sometimes rabbis, especially when giving a class, of course, your job is to analyze and share sources and give text and give guidance. But in the hospital rooms, at the bedside, our focus is really on being there for that person where they are at that moment, and trying to be someone who's listening, who's compassionate, who's non-judgmental, non-anxious. And so really, my primary answer is, I'll say to someone something like, tell me about why you're asking that right now. Tell me about what types of things you have thought of, what's meaningful to you. Tell me more. The key words, the three key words in my work as a chaplain are, tell me more. Tell me more. I'm trying to understand who you are, where you're coming from, what you're thinking about right now. Why are you thinking this? Is it because it feels unjust? Why does it feel unjust? Tell me about it. And let me hear from you. And often what happens is that people appreciate the opportunity to have someone who cares, who's attentive, who's really listening, to listen to them. So they can have a chance to then therefore emote and articulate. And oftentimes, as we have the chance to articulate, we develop our own personal strength. And as you might notice, depending on who you're talking to, different things come out. So if the pharmacist walks into a patient's room and says, how are you doing? So their response might be like, oh, I could use some more pain medication, or I could use this medication, or what's with that? If the person in charge of their menu walks in and says, how are you doing? They'll say, oh, could I have more dessert? Could I have less of this? When a chaplain walks in the room and says, tell me how's it going, different things come out of a person. And so I feel like my role when someone asks me, why do bad things happen to good people, is to be a good listener, to help them try to explore what they're thinking about. And oftentimes they'll find that different things come out that might not have come out in the past, and just help them explore it, and just be someone who, I don't have an answer, but I don't even need to say necessarily, I don't know. I just show that I care, and I feel how horrible it is and how difficult it is, and I'm listening, and I'm with you in the process and the journey. And that's the best answer I could give, is really just to show that I care and I'm compassionate. And I'll just say one last thing, and this, I don't know how to say this without sounding a little bit strange, but there is an aspect of when people are talking to clergy in particular, but not only clergy, that there's almost like, I feel that God has abandoned me. I feel that God is cruel. But now, you know what? There's a rabbi sitting next to me, and the rabbi is nice, and the rabbi is compassionate, and the rabbi cares. You know what? Maybe God isn't abandoning me. It's not that the rabbi's playing God, but someone who's sort of representing God in a way is being nice and compassionate and listening. At least hopefully it feels good to have someone who's representing God in whatever way that means, who's just trying to show compassion and concern and care. And so I just try to model that more than I can actually give an answer.
I love that. We had a brief commemoration for Rabbi Jonathan Sachs this past Monday, and our director of education, Dr. Shore, director in the school, shared that she remembered a story that she remembered when he came to visit, and one of the teachers asked him, what would you say to a student who says they're struggling with their faith and they're pained by it? So he said, I'd give him a hug, right? And that's it's the same concept that you have. It sounds like a philosophical question, but perhaps it's more of a psychological or pastoral kind of question, which is really awesome. So we're getting a number of questions in the chat relating to end of life issues, and I think we're not going to have enough time to get to it. So maybe for next week we'll plan to spend some more time on that. But there were a number of people following up with questions around.
You can forward your questions to us throughout the week also for next week. Yeah,
I'll ask one final from the chat, and then if Rabbi Wahlberg and Rabbi Yogovich want to ask one final question. Someone asked what you do when, and this is sort of can be an end of life question too, but it takes us a little bit of a different direction. What you do when the family is disagreeing about course of treatment or whether to treat or not. Can you walk us through what that process looks like?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most common issues that we face in hospitals, because so frequently you have patients who can't speak for themselves, and there's many options of what to do, and you don't know what they would have wanted if they could speak at this moment. And it's very difficult, and there's a lot of guilt, and there's a lot of struggles with it. Sometimes it's either the family's own guilt, or of the way that they've cared for their parents, or it's just real struggles, or their interpretations of what the patient would want. The best way to mitigate these problems is by having an advance directive, or actually having conversations with one's family beforehand. But I understand that doesn't always happen, and that's not the question. But
Rabbi Weiner, we want to say right now that we're going to make this happen. I know that you do that. You sort of have a talk, a class where you kind of lead people through filling this out. That was something that we had potentially thought about doing with you in person. Whether it's in person, whether it's on Zoom, we're going to do that at some point. So
great.
Lock that away.
Okay, good. That's a great idea. It's really important. When family members don't agree with each other, I mean, the key principle is, first of all, making sure everyone feels heard. We don't want to bulldoze anyone's opinion and feel like that they never got heard, they never got to express. Everyone needs to feel heard, express their opinion. We always need to focus on the fact that the goal of decision making on behalf of patients is what they would have wanted, right? It's substituted judgment. What would they say if they could talk right now? It's not what we think is in their best interest. So we're trying to be somewhat altruistic in terms of not fighting for our opinion about what they should have, but help them to determine what that patient would want. So oftentimes it can help if, let's say, it's a halachic question. Sometimes, there's so much guilt. If we can tell someone, well, here's what, the Torah says, here's what Judaism says, it can take some of the guilt off of them. Oftentimes by having family meetings with staff, with interdisciplinary staff, different perspectives, helping everyone to work it out. Sometimes compromise is possible. And sometimes simply certain positions, certain decisions make more sense. And sometimes, oftentimes actually, as a chaplain, as a rabbi, my job is sort of like to take that person who it seems like their opinion is not going to be the one that is followed, and help them to be okay with that, to kind of mitigate the conflict. But we're trying to, work on shared decision making, coming together on behalf of the loved one. And usually when we have enough, we spend enough time. This takes a lot of time. There's times when my whole day is simply one meeting with a family and doctors, people giving their whole days for just letting everyone hear each other out, talk it out, until we can come up with something that everyone kind of is on the same page as, and work together and hopefully compromise. Or certain people are just going to, have to give in to another approach that seems to be what's best for that patient. It's a big challenge.
Thanks. Absolutely. I've been a part of those meetings sometimes, and
I bet.
it's overwhelming. Rabbi Yogev.
Yes. Just wanted to share, so you reminded me, you're bringing me back to in our days, we had around a month or so of chaplaincy, month or two, even over the summer, of chaplaincy training. So I have you get one unit of work done. So I have a lot of stuff you're saying is bringing back memories, but sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the opposite can happen too when you're representing God. And I experience that sometimes. You're a person of God, where you walk in the room and the person's really upset at God, and you walk in saying, you say, "How you doing?" And they view you as that moment as the representative of God. And you just come in and it can be very sometimes very hectic and overwhelming at those moments.
Yeah.
But
I want you to know, in my experience,
I think your camera's off.
oh, I'm sorry. In my experience, very rarely, for some reason, have I had to deal with people who are angry with God. First of all, when you're dealing with older people today, in Israel, the oldest living Israeli died. I think it was either 107 or 117. And they said that he died from isolation. No, I think he died from being 117 years old. Not too many people die from that, but that is a killer. Most people today are living far beyond the time that they thought they would live when they were youngsters. So I don't find very often there's questions about God. When it's dealing with somebody very young, I'm more apt to explain it that this is a matter of their genetics and a matter of their DNA, and it had nothing to do with whether they were being good or bad or God's choice. It's just when it depends upon your mother and father. If they had diabetes, there's a good chance you're going to get diabetes. And it has nothing to do with how you behave. When you go to a doctor, the doctor doesn't ask you if you've been good or bad. He asks you for a family history. And a lot of your physical makeup is based on that family history. And I have found that a lot of people find comfort in my, I hate to put it like this, taking it away from God. Now, this is not God's decision. This is the makeup of the human being and the natural laws of the universe in which God created. And I have found that for the people that I have spoken with, that has oftentimes been very, very comforting.
That's because after you finish telling them that, they come to me and Rabbi Yogev.
We want to hear from a real rabbi.
But I actually wanted to ask you, like heading out, just like kind of like end on a good note, some sort of inspirational story, something quick that happened that really brought a lot of positive energy into the hospital, to your life, some sort of something you get the anecdote you can think about.
And you can't tell them the chauffeur story.
Yeah, you can't tell that one.
Because I used that and quoted you on my Rosh Hashanah sermon.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot, I'll tell you this, because when I first started at the hospital, because we're mentioning all the sad things and all the pain and all the suffering and all the questions people ask. And at first I was overwhelmed by the suffering and seeing so much death and sickness. And it was hard to deal with every single day, all day. And so I asked a mentor, how can I live like this? How can I go to a hospital every day and see so much pain and suffering and death? I don't see how someone could have a career doing this. It's horrible. So he said to me, it depends on your perspective. It depends on how you look at things. It is true that as a rabbi, you're being called in oftentimes to some of the most painful and difficult scenarios. But if you begin to pay close attention, you will see that the vast majority of people who come into the hospital come in very sick, very worried, very anxious, and the vast majority of them leave healthy. The vast majority don't die. The vast majority don't get worse. The vast majority actually do better. And I began to notice that is, in fact, the reality, that most, as the Talmud says this, Rov Cholim L'chaim, most people come into the hospital and actually do much better. And in fact, he also said to me, he said, you're saying they're sick, but emotionally, these are the healthiest people you ever meet. I mean, where else can you start talking to someone and within a minute, you're opening up about your deepest things. Your people are crying. People are sharing things. This conversation we're having tonight. People are having conversations about real things, real meaningful things. That's a sign of healthy emotional health. And so, you actually find in hospitals tremendous health, emotional health, and recovery. And so we see a lot of recovery here in the hospital. A lot of people doing better. The vast majority of COVID patients, we've seen people very sick, and the vast majority are doing extremely well today, thank God. We watch people I'll end with this. How about speaking of COVID, there was one day when all the shuls in LA, and I think around the country at that time, everything was closed, no shuls. I walked into our COVID ICU and I look around, they're all glass doors. I look around, I realize, oh my gosh, we have a minyan. We have a minyan in here. There's so many religious Jewish patients in here that we actually have a minyan. I could daven mincha right now.
That's such a rabbi thing to do.
Which is sad, but I was like, wow, there's so many Jews. And unfortunately, the reason I was there is because I was getting called by families one at a time to say vidui with them.
Wow.
And, I had to say it outside the door, couldn't go inside the room. Sometimes over the phone, the nurse would bring the phone in. And I ended up saying vidui 12 times that way, 12 times. And we only said vidui when people were likely to die. They were on their last days, last hours. Many of these cases, literally last minutes, they were calling the family, the patient's dying. And what was amazing was of those 12 patients, 11 out of 12 recovered, completely recovered. One of them even called me, the daughter called me and said, I want you to know, I don't know if you remember, you said vidui with my mother, and she's right here with me. we're baking challah for Shabbos together right now. She's home. We're making challah together.
Wow.
It's incredible. So we see a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, and we focus on the pain and suffering, but we forget to focus on also the incredible recovery, the incredible health that people experience. And that's here too. That you see in the hospital as well, in the front lines.
Wow.
And elsewhere, the recovery.
That's tremendous. We'll let Rabbi Wahlberg get in the last question or the last word. Before he does so, these were complicated questions, but none were as difficult as our trivia question here today.
Okay, so our trivia question was, how many times does Eliezer's his first name appear in our Parsha? And the answer is 0. Okay, there are 67 verses that deal with Eliezer. Avram's name appears 37 times, Yitzchak's 13, Rivka 12. Eliezer doesn't appear 0, but he's in 67 verses. What's the message? It's what we're talking about tonight, this idea of being in service of others. Being in service of others, not worrying about yourself, about your name. In the end, he's at the centerpiece. He is the centerpiece of our parasha. It shows you Hashem raises those up who raise other people up. And thank you for all the good that you're doing for your community and for Am Yisrael, Rabbi Weiner.
I've got to give credit where credit is due. Searle Mitnick, if he's
Yes.
on, was the first one to point out to me that Eliezer, that this Avram servant is never called Eliezer in the Parsha here. We don't really know that it is actually Eliezer.
Yeah, he's either called Ha'eved or Ha'ish, which Ha'eved means the servant. So that's that highlights kind of what I was talking about.
Rabbi Wahlberg, any final words for our guest or questions?
You mean before I go back to good night, Trump? Yeah, I want to tell you something, everyone. This was really a it was a good experience for me. I'll tell you why. I've been spending a good part of my day sitting in front of this computer. And the rest of the day, I'm just reading. I hardly ever leave the house. And I'm astounded what you can learn from the computer, even Jewishly. But ultimately, we need people like you. Because all of the things we discussed tonight, you can't get that answer from a computer. It has to come from a mind and a heart, and you really bring that together. And this has really been a very positive experience for me, reminding me of that.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. It's definitely mutual. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being with us. Like Rabbi Yogev said, you can send in to any of the rabbis questions that you'd like for topic for discussion for next week, where we'll have Rabbi Weiner back for round number 2. And I have a feeling that everyone who is joining us this evening is going to be back with us next week, and you can spread the word to others that if they didn't join us, they could see the recording of this. We'll have it up, but they also missed out on getting it live. Thank you, everyone, very much for like Rabbi Wahlberg said.
And Rabbi Weiner, if you come back, you will be setting the record. The first guest we had who came back.
Wow, I'll come back. I'll be back.
That's right.
I'm willing.
The first
Thank you.
non-Hasidic one.
That's right. The first one we asked to come back.
Yes,
People
okay,
shouldn't
fair.
ask the others not to.
Fair enough.
Yeah, exactly. Have a great evening,
Thank you,
everyone.
my
Take
honor.
care. All the best.
Good to see you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Have a good Shabbos.